everyone remembers the Iron Throne. They remember the Starks, the Lannisters, the Targaryens, and the war that determined the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. But that story is only a brief chapter in a world whose history stretches back more than 12,000 years. Long before there were kings, castles, or dragons soaring across the skies, Westeros was a land of endless forests untouched by human hands. Ancient creatures ruled the wilderness for countless generations, while civilizations rose, flourished, and slowly faded into legend. As the ages passed, new peoples crossed the seas, kingdoms took shape, faiths were born, vast empires reached unimaginable heights, and others disappeared forever, leaving behind only ruins, forgotten stories, and names that outlived the people who once bore them. Tonight, we won't simply revisit the story told in a television series. Instead, we'll journey through the birth, rise, and transformation of an entire world, as if we were opening the history book of a civilization that truly existed. Because only by exploring the thousands of years that shaped Westeros and Essos can you understand why the Iron Throne came to define the destiny of so many, and why, in the end, even it could not withstand the passage of time. Before you settle in for tonight's story, if you're enjoying what we do here, a like or a subscribe helps more than you'd think, but only if it's genuine. And if you've got a moment, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. It's always my favorite part of reading through the comments. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin. For thousands of years, no human being ever set foot in Westeros. There were no castles, no kings. No one had ever spoken the names Winterfell, Casterly Rock, or King's Landing. Even the idea of the Iron Throne belonged to a future so unimaginably distant that no one could have conceived of it. If you had looked upon the continent in those days, you would have found a land ruled almost entirely by nature. Vast forests stretched across much of the landscape. Ancient mountain ranges divided entire regions. Rivers carved their way through the wilderness with no bridges to cross them, while enormous beasts wandered open plains that had never known the march of an army. Even the seasons refused to follow any predictable pattern. Winters could last for years. Summers seemed endless. The land itself moved to a rhythm unlike anything later civilizations would ever know, forcing every living creature to adapt to changes no one could control. The first known inhabitants of Westeros were not human. They were the children of the forest. Even the wisest maesters, who devoted their lives to studying the oldest surviving records, could never say with certainty where they came from. Some legends claimed they were born alongside the trees themselves. Others insisted they had simply always existed, long before anyone was left to remember their beginning. What is certain is that, by the time the earliest history of Westeros begins, the children had already lived there for countless generations. They were small in stature, yet astonishingly long-lived. Their lives were deeply intertwined with the natural world, and everything they did revolved around the sacred weirwood groves. With their pale white trunks and faces carved into the bark, these ancient trees would eventually become one of the oldest and most enduring symbols of the continent. To the children, they were never just trees. They were memory itself. Each grove preserved the lives of those who had come before. Every carved face seemed to watch the centuries drift quietly past. If you had spent an entire night beneath one of those weirwoods, you might have felt as though the whole forest was breathing around you. The children never built towering cities or raised monuments of stone. Their civilization followed an entirely different path. They took only what they needed from the forest without permanently changing it. They hunted only enough to survive, believing that they were simply one part of a balance far greater than themselves. They never sought to dominate nature. They sought to live alongside it. That difference would shape the future of Westeros more than anyone could have imagined. Again and again, the history of the continent would become a struggle between two very different ways of seeing the world. Those who chose to live with the land, and those determined to conquer it. But the children of the forest were not alone. In the cold northern mountains lived the giants. Their immense size would eventually lead many people to dismiss them as nothing more than legend. Yet the oldest accounts, preserved independently across different traditions, all describe them as a real race perfectly adapted to the unforgiving wilderness of the north. Their strength was extraordinary. They could bring down massive trees with ease and travel across landscapes where few other creatures could survive. Unlike the giants of many fantasy tales, these were neither empire builders nor conquerors. They lived in scattered clans. They followed the great animal migrations. And their relationship with the children of the forest appears to have been one of peaceful coexistence, built on mutual respect rather than conflict. For thousands of years, that balance remained almost unchanged. The forests continued to grow. The giants roamed the mountains. The children watched over their sacred groves. The continent seemed to have found a harmony that could last forever. But the history of civilizations has a way of changing the moment someone new arrives. And far to the south, beyond the sea and beyond the mountains, another people had begun to look toward a distant land they did not yet know would one day become their home. Across the narrow sea, on a continent the people of Westeros had never even imagined, different groups of humans had spent generations searching for new lands. They were not a single kingdom. They did not answer to one ruler. Instead, they were scattered tribes connected by shared customs, a common language, and a constant need to find fertile land, grazing fields, and a better future for their families. Over time, those migrations carried them to the western edge of Essos. There, they discovered a vast stretch of land linking the two continents together. The Maestas would one day remember it as the Arm of Dawn. But in those distant days, it was no legend. It was a natural bridge of stone, forests, and rolling hills, allowing travelers to walk from Essos into Westeros without ever setting foot on a ship. It's unlikely that anyone in those first migrations realized the importance of the journey they were beginning. They weren't setting out to build an empire. They weren't dreaming of conquering an entire continent. They were simply moving forward, just as their ancestors had done for generations. Human history is filled with moments like these. The greatest transformations rarely begin with carefully laid plans. More often, they begin with small communities searching for richer farmland, fresh pastures, or a safer place to raise their children. Only centuries later do we realize that those simple decisions reshaped the world. The moment the first men crossed the Arm of Dawn, Westeros ceased to be an isolated land. For the first time, two intelligent races shared the same continent. At first, their meeting was not defined by war. The newcomers settled in open spaces, built modest villages, and began exploring lands no humans had ever seen before. To them, the endless forest seemed almost limitless. The trees meant timber for homes. Cleared land meant fertile fields. The rivers offered food, fresh water, and easy travel. Everything invited them to stay. But what the first men saw as natural resources, the children of the forest saw as part of something sacred. Every tree that fell altered a landscape that had remained almost untouched for thousands of years. Every new settlement claimed ground that other beings had long called home. The conflict did not begin because one side was good and the other evil. It began because they understood the world in completely different ways. The first men changed the land in order to survive. The children had survived by learning to change themselves instead. Two different philosophies. Two civilizations moving toward an inevitable collision. The first clashes were small. A dispute over a forest. A hunting ground. A river. But with each passing generation, those isolated conflicts grew into a war that spread across nearly the entire continent. The first men possessed bronze weapons, and their numbers increased with every generation. The children of the forest knew every hidden path through the woods and fought with tactics that left their enemies confused and frustrated. Neither side could claim a decisive victory. The war seemed endless. And as both peoples fought for the future of Westeros, neither could have imagined that this long struggle would eventually force one desperate decision, a decision that would reshape the geography of the continent forever. The war dragged on for generations. Children inherited a conflict that had begun long before their parents were born, and grandchildren grew up listening to stories of battles that seemed to have neither a beginning nor an end. Little by little, war stopped being an extraordinary event and became an ordinary part of life. The first men continued crossing from Essos. Each new wave brought more villages, more farmland, and more forests cleared for settlement. The human population grew at a pace the children of the forest had never witnessed before. For the first time, they realized they could no longer survive simply by waiting. They had to stop more people from reaching Westeros. It was then that they turned to a form of magic so powerful that even they used it with great caution. According to the oldest legends, the wisest among the children gathered at the southern end of the great land bridge connecting Essos and Westeros. There, they performed a ritual whose true nature has been lost to history. Only one part of the story remains the same in every version. The earth shook. The sea surged through the stone. And the vast bridge that had connected the two continents for countless ages disappeared beneath the waves. That was the birth of the narrow sea passage that would forever separate Dorne from Essos. To this day, the Maesters still debate how much of that story is history and how much is legend. Some believe a massive natural catastrophe was later attributed to the magic of the children. Others argue that the magical explanation is simply the only way later generations could describe an event they no longer understood. Whatever the truth may have been, the outcome was undeniable. The land bridge was gone. From that day forward, reaching Westeros became far more difficult. To the children of the forest, it must have seemed like a victory. They had closed the continent's main gateway and dramatically slowed the arrival of new settlers. For a time, they may even have believed that the old balance would gradually return. But the war had already changed too much. The first men who remained in Westeros were now too numerous. They had built permanent settlements. They had raised families. This was no longer a distant land waiting to be explored. It was home. The fighting slowly shifted farther north. The great forests began to shrink. With every generation, humanity claimed a little more territory, while the children retreated from lands they had considered sacred for thousands of years. And yet, even after centuries of conflict, neither side could destroy the other. There were too many humans to drive away. The children knew the forests too well to be wiped out. Both civilizations were beginning to accept an uncomfortable truth. Neither could achieve a final victory. And as has happened so many times throughout our own history, when a war lasts long enough, even the oldest enemies begin to wonder whether there might be another way to survive. Far from the battlefields, hidden beneath the mist at the center of a quiet lake, lay a small island that had not yet played any role in history. Before long, it would become the setting for one of the most important agreements ever made in Westeros. The island was small. Little more than a patch of land surrounded by the still waters of a vast lake. Yet its location made it neutral ground, far from the bloodiest battlefields and sheltered by dense weirwood groves whose roots seemed to reach back further than memory itself. In time, it would become known as the Isle of Faces. And it was here that the first great war in the history of Westeros would finally come to an end. No one knows exactly how the negotiations began. Historical records are scarce, while legends are plentiful. Some accounts claim it was the children of the forest who proposed the meeting after realizing the war was destroying the very world they had fought to protect. Others suggest that the leaders of the first men had begun to understand that conquering every forest would come at a price too great to bear. Perhaps both sides reached the same conclusion at the same time. After centuries of bloodshed, neither could build a future if the fighting never ended. And so, the pact was born. Representatives of the first men and the children of the forest gathered beneath the ancient weirwoods of the island to forge a new way of living together. Its terms were remarkably simple. The first men would keep the open lands, the grasslands, and the territories they had already settled. The children would retain the great sacred forests and the lands where the weirwoods remained at the heart of their world. Most importantly, each people would acknowledge the other's right to exist. It was far more than a peace treaty. It marked the beginning of a political balance between two civilizations that could hardly have been more different. If we look back at our own history, we find similar agreements at the end of long and exhausting wars. Rarely do they leave either side completely satisfied, but they succeed in ending conflicts that have already claimed far too many lives. That is exactly what the pact represented. Not a victory, a solution. As a symbol of their agreement, the first men pledged to protect the weirwood groves. From that moment on, those ancient trees became more than part of the landscape. They became sacred to the newcomers as well. Gradually, many of the first men abandoned their old beliefs and embraced the faith of the children of the forest. This was the birth of the old gods. Unlike the religions that would arrive centuries later, The worship of the old gods had no towering temples, no powerful priesthood, and no sacred books. Its rituals were quiet. They took place before a wayward tree, beneath the canopy of a silent forest, with nothing but the wind to accompany the prayers. That quiet spirituality would shape the identity of the North for thousands of years. Even after new faiths crossed the narrow sea, many noble families would continue to pray exactly as the first men had after the pact was signed. For a long time, Westeros enjoyed a peace unlike anything it had known before. Villages grew. The forests were no longer battlefields. New generations came to know the other people more as neighbors than as enemies. That did not mean every tension had disappeared. But survival no longer depended on endless war. It was one of the defining moments in the history of the continent. For the first time, Westeros was no longer shaped by constant conflict. It slowly began to develop into something far more complex. A civilization. Human families grew into noble bloodlines. Small settlements evolved into fortified strongholds. And while the children of the forest gradually withdrew into the wild places of the world, the descendants of the first men began laying the foundations of the great houses that, thousands of years later, would still shape the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. The centuries that followed the pact were, compared to everything that had come before, remarkably peaceful. Not because conflict had disappeared, but because, for the first time, the people of Westeros could spend entire generations building instead of simply surviving. Small villages gradually expanded. Wooden huts gave way to stronger fortifications. The narrow trails once used by hunters slowly evolved into trade routes, carrying food, tools, and news between communities that grew farther apart with every passing generation. War had finally made room for progress. And with that progress came something that had barely existed before. Memory. Families began preserving the stories of those who came before them. The names of great leaders endured long after their deaths. Slowly, the first great bloodlines of Westeros began to emerge. They were not yet the powerful noble houses that would one day shape the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. But their foundations had already been laid. Each region gradually developed an identity of its own. The vast plains that would one day become the reach encouraged farming and the growth of stable communities. The rugged mountains of the west gave rise to isolated settlements that learned to depend on themselves. And in the north, the long, unforgiving winters shaped a culture where preparation and resilience mattered far more than wealth. Without realizing it, the continent itself was creating different peoples. Geography has always been one of history's greatest architects. Rivers shape trade. Mountains create borders. Forests offer protection, or isolation. And long winters force people to see the world differently from those who live in gentler climates. Westeros was no exception. While humanity flourished, the children of the forest began a much quieter transformation. They were still there. Their sacred groves remained untouched. But with each passing century, they made up a smaller part of the continent's population. They were not driven out by a great war. They simply ceased to occupy the central place they had held for thousands of years. It was a slow change, almost impossible to notice within a single lifetime. But viewed through the lens of history, it marked the beginning of the end for their civilization. Something similar happened to the giants. They continued wandering the frozen lands of the far north, keeping their distance from the growing human settlements. For generations, there was little contact between the two peoples. The giants lived much as they always had, while the rest of the continent transformed at an ever-increasing pace. As the years passed, stories about them slowly drifted into legend. Children grew up hearing tales of enormous beings that roamed beyond the forests and the mountains, even though very few had ever seen one with their own eyes. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the history of Westeros. What disappears from everyday life eventually becomes myth. Meanwhile, the younger generations of humans no longer remembered the Great War against the children of the forest. To most of them, the pact belonged to a past so distant that it was almost impossible to separate history from legend. Heroes began to replace eyewitnesses. And when a civilization begins remembering legends instead of memories, it is often entering a new chapter of its history. An age when great builders, legendary kings, and seemingly impossible deeds come to define the identity of an entire people. Many centuries later, the Maesters would give that era a name: the Age of Heroes. The Age of Heroes occupies a unique place in the history of Westeros. It stands on the boundary between history and myth. The major events almost certainly happened, but their details were passed down through songs, oral traditions, and legends that changed with every passing generation. That does not mean they should be dismissed. The same is true of many civilizations in our own world. The earliest kings of Egypt, the founders of Rome, and the heroes of ancient Greece are all wrapped in stories that are impossible to verify completely. Yet those stories still reveal how those societies understood their own beginnings. Westeros was no different. It was during this age that the legendary figures who would define each region of the continent first emerged. In the north, every story begins with one name: Brandon the Builder. No one can say with certainty who he truly was. Some Maesters believe there were several different Brandons whose deeds were gradually woven together into a single legendary figure. Others argue that he was one extraordinary man whose life was magnified by thousands of years of oral tradition. Whatever the truth, his legacy outlived any account of his life. He is credited with the construction of Winterfell. It was far more than a fortress. It was a declaration of permanence. Until then, most important settlements had grown gradually around villages or relatively simple defensive positions. Winterfell was something different. It was built to endure for generations. Its immense stone walls, spacious courtyards, towering keeps, and, above all, its natural hot springs allowed warmth to flow through the castle even during the harshest winters. This was not simply a stronghold built to protect one family. It was built to preserve an entire way of life. Brandon's descendants would eventually become House Stark. Thousands of years later, they would still rule from that very same seat. Few dynasties, whether in the history of Westeros or in our own world, can claim such extraordinary continuity. While the North raised its great stronghold, other regions were also creating the legends that would shape their identities. In the West, another famous figure emerged: Lann the Clever. The stories say he did not win Casterly Rock through military conquest. He claimed it through wit. Some versions tell that he slipped unnoticed into the fortress and caused such confusion among its inhabitants that they abandoned it themselves. Others claim he outsmarted the mighty House Casterly, taking possession of their castle without ever fighting a great battle. It is impossible to know where history ends and legend begins. But the message behind the tale is revealing. While some regions celebrated strength above all else, the West came to admire something different as well: intelligence, strategy, and the ability to gain power without always relying on force. It would not be the last time that way of thinking defined the Lannisters. Garth Greenhand occupied a very different place in the legends. While Brandon came to symbolize endurance and Lann embodied cunning, Garth was remembered as the father of abundance. The stories say that wherever he walked, the fields flourished. Trees bore richer fruit. Harvests became more plentiful. Livestock thrived as never before. As with so many figures from the Age of Heroes, it is difficult to separate myth from history. Most likely, Garth preserves the memory of a time when agriculture began transforming the fertile lands of southern Westeros. Over the centuries, countless noble families would claim descent from him. Among them was the powerful House Gardener, which would rule the Reach for thousands of years, along with many other houses that sought to strengthen their legitimacy by tracing their bloodline back to the most revered hero those lands had ever known. Each region was building its own memory. There was no single history of Westeros. There were many. Every people remembered its own heroes, celebrated its own triumphs, and passed down its own version of the past to the next generation. In the Stormlands, another legendary figure emerged: Doran Godsgrief. According to the tales, he defied the gods themselves by building a castle so he could live beside the woman he loved. In answer, mighty storms shattered his fortress again and again, forcing him to rebuild it over and over until he finally raised a castle capable of withstanding even the fury of the heavens. That, the legends say, was the birth of Storm's End. Perhaps we will never know how much of that story is true. But the castle itself was real. And for thousands of years, it would remain all but impregnable, standing as one of the greatest achievements of Westerosi architecture. Far to the west, on the Iron Islands, an entirely different culture was beginning to take shape. Separated from the mainland by the sea, its people built their lives around sailing, fishing, and, in time, raiding. Their legends spoke of the Grey King, an almost mythical ruler who was said to have mastered the storms themselves and earned the favor of the drowned god. As elsewhere across the continent, those stories blended historical memory with symbols meant to explain the origins of a people. Yet they also revealed a profound difference. While much of Westeros measured wealth by fertile land or prosperous trade, the islanders learned to measure it by the ships they could build, and the voyages they were bold enough to undertake. Little by little, the continent began to take on the political shape it would preserve for thousands of years. In the north, the kings of winter solidified their rule. In the west, the kings of the rock continued to grow in power. In the Reach, the Gardeners established their dynasty. In the Stormlands, House Durrandon reigned. And in the Vale, the Arryns gradually extended their influence from the mountains. Centuries would still pass before the Seven Kingdoms existed as we know them. But their roots had already sunk deep into the soil of Westeros. It was an age of growth. Fortresses became larger. Families expanded their domains. Roads connected settlements that had once seemed impossibly far apart. Nothing suggested that this slow and steady prosperity was about to come to an end. Yet far to the north, beyond the forests and mountains where almost no humans ventured, the world had begun to grow colder in ways no one had ever experienced before. At first, the winters lasted only a little longer. Then the harvests began to fail. The great animals changed the paths of their migrations. And without anyone yet understanding what was happening, an ancient darkness was slowly spreading across the continent. The Age of Heroes was drawing to its end. If the heroes had built the known world, the long night came perilously close to destroying it. No kingdom was prepared for a winter that seemed as though it would never end. Food became scarce. Trade routes vanished beneath endless snow. Animals either migrated south or died before they could find enough to eat. One by one, the smallest villages were abandoned. For the first time since the arrival of the first men, the survival of civilization itself seemed uncertain. But famine was only the beginning. From the farthest reaches of the north came stories that were almost impossible to believe. Travelers disappearing without a trace. Forests where not a single sound could be heard. Corpses discovered far from the places where they had fallen. At first, most people dismissed these tales as little more than superstitions born from fear. That is often how history unfolds. The greatest threats are rarely recognized when they first appear. Yet as the years passed, the same stories began emerging from places too distant from one another to be dismissed as coincidence. The White Walkers were advancing, slowly but relentlessly, toward the south. The legends describe them as tall, silent beings of living ice, untouched by a cold that no other creature could survive. Their very presence seemed to drain the warmth from the world itself. But what truly inspired terror was not their appearance. It was the realization that death no longer meant the end. The fallen could rise again. Not as the people they had once been, but as silent servants of the enemy. Every battle that was lost made the army marching from the north even stronger. Every defeat made the next victory harder to achieve. It was a war unlike any that had come before. Defeating the enemy was no longer enough. The dead themselves had to be kept from swelling its ranks. Old rivalries began to fade. The kings understood that continuing to fight one another would only hasten their extinction. The descendants of Brandon, of Lann, and of Duran now faced an enemy that cared nothing for castles or crowns. Its purpose was far simpler: to leave no living soul behind. Amid that darkness, one figure emerged from the mists of legend. The songs never preserved his true name. They remember him only as the last hero. It is said that he left his home accompanied by a handful of warriors, several horses, and a faithful dog, determined to find whatever help remained to save mankind. One by one, his companions perished. The horses succumbed to the cold. Even the dog disappeared into the endless snow. In the end, the last hero continued alone. If these stories hold even a fragment of truth, It is not difficult to imagine the despair of that journey. Walking for days without finding food. Never knowing whether another sunrise would come. Hearing nothing but the wind while the whole world seemed to freeze around you. When all hope appeared lost, the last hero found the children of the forest. Those ancient inhabitants of Westeros, who centuries before had waged war against the first men, understood that the old conflict no longer mattered. If the White Walkers prevailed, they would make no distinction between humans and the children. Both would vanish together. For the first time since the pact, the two peoples would stand side by side once more. Not to fight over land, but to fight for the survival of the known world. The children of the forest possessed something the human armies did not. They had known the north long before the first kingdoms ever existed. They knew where to hide, which mountain passes to avoid, which forests could still offer sanctuary. Their ancient magic, the same mysterious power long associated with the werewolves, was called upon once again, at a moment when survival depended on every advantage that could be found. We do not know what that war truly looked like. No chronicler was there to record its battles. All that remains are fragments of songs and traditions passed down across thousands of years. Yet every version agrees on one essential truth. Humans and the children of the forest fought side by side. That alliance finally brought centuries of distrust to an end. Faced with a threat capable of extinguishing all life, the differences that had once seemed impossible to overcome no longer mattered. Meanwhile, across the narrow sea in Essos, remarkably similar stories were beginning to emerge. There, the legend spoke not of the last hero, but of a champion named Aegon Ahai. According to ancient tradition, he devoted countless attempts to forging a sword powerful enough to defeat the darkness. The tales say that he shattered 2 blades before succeeding with the third. Only on that final attempt did he create the perfect weapon. To do so, he was forced to sacrifice the one person he loved above all others. His wife, Nissa. When the blade pierced her heart, her soul became part of the steel itself, giving birth to the sword known as Lightbringer. It is impossible to know whether the last hero and Aegon Ahai were different people, or simply different versions of the same memory preserved by separate civilizations. What matters most is something else. Both continents preserved the memory of a great darkness, and of a hero who helped bring it to an end. That suggests the Long Night was far greater than we usually imagine. It did not threaten Westeros alone. It changed the entire world. After years of struggle, the legends tell us that the darkness finally began to retreat. The White Walkers were driven back into the farthest reaches of the north. The relentless cold ceased its advance. Slowly, the days regained their familiar length. The snow began to withdraw from the fields. The first green shoots emerged where, for years, there had been nothing but ice. For those who survived, it must have felt as though they were witnessing the birth of a new world. But victory did not erase fear. Everyone understood that if such a threat had appeared once, it could return again. And it was precisely that fear that inspired one of the most extraordinary constructions in the entire history of Westeros. The survivors did not respond by celebrating. They responded by preparing. No one could say with certainty that the White Walkers had been destroyed forever. If they had once emerged from the frozen lands beyond the far north, they could do so again. The memory of the Long Night was still too fresh to ignore that possibility. It is here that the name of Brandon the Builder appears once more. The traditions credit him with a second monumental achievement, even greater than Winterfell itself. The Wall. According to the chronicles, the immense barrier of ice was raised with the strength of the giants, the ancient knowledge of the children of the forest, and the labor of thousands of men who understood that what they were building would not protect only their own generation, but every generation yet to come. Rising more than 700 feet in places and stretching from one side of the continent to the other, the wall became the greatest construction ever undertaken in Westeros. Even thousands of years later, those who saw it for the first time struggled to believe that human hands could have created something so immense. It was more than a fortress. It was a boundary between two worlds. To the south lay the kingdoms, the cultivated fields, and the towns and cities that would slowly flourish once again. To the north stretched a vast, untamed wilderness where the memory of the Long Night would endure far longer than anywhere else. Yet no wall, however mighty, can defend a kingdom on its own. It needs people willing to stand watch. And so, the Night's Watch was born. In its earliest years, joining the watch was considered one of the highest honors imaginable. Many of its brothers were celebrated veterans of the long night, sons of noble families, or seasoned warriors who understood exactly why the wall had been built. They were not there to defend a king, nor to serve any single house. Their oath was sworn to the entire continent. Every ranger who walked atop the wall embodied a promise made by a generation that had watched the world stand on the edge of extinction. As long as they remained at their posts, humanity would have a chance if the darkness ever returned. As the centuries passed, those experiences gradually faded from living memory. The winters remained long, but they became familiar once more. The harvest returned. The cities grew again. Children were raised on stories of creatures made of ice that no one alive had ever seen. Little by little, the long night ceased to be remembered as history. It became a legend. And as so often happens throughout history, what one generation accepts as a warning, the next begins to dismiss as nothing more than a story. While Westeros slowly rebuilt its kingdoms, a civilization was beginning to rise across the narrow sea whose power would eclipse anything the world had ever known. Its name would be remembered for thousands of years. Valyria.
When the people of Westeros were only beginning to rebuild after the long night, a civilization was emerging across the narrow sea that would one day reshape the destiny of the world. Its name was Valyria. Unlike the ancient kingdoms of Westeros, Valyria did not rise beside a great river or across fertile plains. It was born on a peninsula dominated by volcanoes. The land was dangerous. The air was thick with smoke and sulfur. For generations, it seemed like one of the least promising places in all of Essos. And yet, it was there that one of the greatest transformations in history began. Valyrian tradition tells of humble shepherds who were the first to discover dragons living among the volcanic peaks known as the 14 Flames. These were not tame creatures. They were wild predators, feared by anyone foolish enough to wander too close to their nests. What happened next remains one of the greatest mysteries of the known world. No one knows exactly how those early shepherds managed to approach the dragons without being destroyed. The oldest accounts speak of forgotten knowledge, inherited magic, and a unique bond between certain bloodlines and these magnificent beasts. Whatever the explanation may have been, the result changed the balance of power forever. For the first time, humanity no longer feared dragons. They learned to ride them. Dragons were far more than living weapons. They could cross immense distances in a matter of hours. They carried people and goods faster than the world had ever known. And above all, they gave their riders a military advantage that was almost impossible to challenge. While every other civilization relied on walls, armies, or fleets, Valyria commanded the skies. From that moment onward, its rise was extraordinary. What had begun as a modest settlement among volcanoes gradually became a city of immense wealth and growing power. Generation after generation, Valyrian knowledge of metallurgy, architecture, navigation, and magic continued to advance. Their smiths even mastered the art of forging a remarkable kind of steel. Valyrian steel blades would keep their edge for centuries, eventually becoming some of the most prized weapons in the entire known world. As time passed, other cities began looking toward Valyria with a mixture of admiration and fear. A new power had been born, and it was only taking its first steps.
Valyria soon discovered that its true strength did not lie in dragons alone. It lay in organization. Unlike the kingdoms ruled by a single monarch, the Valyrians developed a very different political system. Several dragonlord families shared power, competing with one another while collectively governing what would later become known as the Valyrian Freehold. There was no absolute emperor. The greatest decisions were made by the most influential families, all of whom shared one defining trait. They possessed dragons. It created an aristocracy unlike any other in the known world. In Westeros, noble authority came from the ownership of land. In Valyria, true prestige rested on bloodline and on the ability to command a dragon. With each passing generation, the freehold grew stronger. Neighboring cities gradually became either valued trading partners or conquered territories. The sea lanes fell under Valyrian influence. Its ports flourished through a vast commercial network that connected nearly every corner of the known world. But economic prosperity was only one part of Valyria's expansion. Whenever another power refused to submit, dragons appeared in the sky. For thousands of years, city walls had been the greatest defensive achievement civilization could produce. Valyria proved that even the mightiest fortress could fall when the enemy attacked from above. One of the earliest great victims of this expansion was the ancient Giscari Empire. For centuries, it had dominated much of southern Essos through disciplined armies and a formidable military tradition. But no infantry formation, however well trained, was prepared to face a dragon. The Giscari legions were defeated one after another. Their cities were destroyed or brought beneath Valyrian rule. With that victory, Valyria made one thing unmistakably clear. A new age had begun. This was not simply another empire. It was the greatest power the world had ever seen. As its borders expanded, so did its cultural influence. The Valyrian language spread across countless cities. Its architecture became a model others sought to imitate. Its steel was coveted by kings and warriors alike. Even peoples who had never laid eyes on a dragon used coins, goods, and knowledge that had found their way from Valyria. It was much like the greatest empires of our own history. Rome, for example, did not merely expand its borders. It spread its language, its laws, its roads, and its vision of civilization itself. Valyria achieved something remarkably similar, though it rested upon a military advantage no rival could hope to match. For centuries, it seemed impossible to imagine a future in which such an empire could ever fall. And it is often at the very moment a civilization believes itself invincible, that history quietly begins preparing its downfall. At the height of its power, the Valyrian freehold ruled over much of the known world. Its influence stretched from the western shores of Essos to lands far to the east, while dozens of cities paid tribute or depended upon Valyrian trade to sustain their prosperity. Few civilizations had ever reached such extraordinary wealth. Dragons secured the trade routes. The mines yielded precious metals. Its ports welcomed goods from nearly every corner of the known world. Its prosperity seemed without limit. Yet every great empire eventually faces the same question. How do you govern a realm that has become too vast to be ruled from a single place? Valyria's answer was to establish new cities and strengthen those that already existed. Over the centuries, powerful centers of commerce emerged that, although they enjoyed considerable autonomy, remained firmly within the Valyrian sphere of influence. Some of them would one day become the famed free cities. Lys became renowned for its immense wealth and thriving maritime trade. Myr earned its reputation through the unmatched skill of its craftsmen, engineers, and artisans. Tyrosh flourished thanks to its strategic position along the Great Sea Lanes. Volantis, one of the oldest of them all, came to be regarded as the natural heir to Valyrian power. And then there was Braavos. Braavos was different. Its origins were not rooted in conquest. According to tradition, it was founded in secret by escaped slaves fleeing the rule of the freehold. For generations, the city remained hidden among lagoons and drifting mists, growing beyond the sight of the dragon lords. In time, it would become one of the greatest financial and naval powers in the world. It was one of history's great ironies. While Valyria stood as the greatest slave empire of its age, one of its future rivals had been born from the simple desire to escape slavery itself. Because beneath all its splendor, the freehold had a far darker side. Much of its immense wealth rested upon the forced labor of millions of enslaved people. They built the roads. They worked the mines. They cultivated the fields. And they carried out the most dangerous tasks around the 14 Flames, where blistering heat and poisonous volcanic gases turned every day into a struggle to survive. The magnificent palaces of the Dragon Lords were built upon the labor of people who would never share in the prosperity they created. As with so many great empires throughout our own history, astonishing economic achievement existed alongside profound inequality. And yet, from the outside, everything appeared to be thriving. The cities continued to grow. The dragons multiplied. The ruling families amassed unimaginable fortunes. No one suspected that the greatest danger would not come from a foreign army. It had been waiting beneath their feet for millions of years. Deep within the heart of the 14 Flames, the earth was beginning to awaken. For centuries, the volcanoes had been the beating heart of Valyrian power. From them came extraordinary minerals. Their slopes were home to the dragons. And around the 14 Flames rose the greatest city the world had ever known. Those mountains had given Valyria its wealth, its knowledge, and its dominion over much of Essos. But the very force that had made the empire possible would ultimately bring about its destruction. 12 years before the catastrophe, something happened that almost no one considered important. A young girl named Daenerys Targaryen began having disturbing dreams. They were more than ordinary nightmares. She claimed to see Valyria consumed by fire and reduced to ruins. Her father, Aegon Targaryen, made a decision that many of his contemporaries regarded as madness. He sold much of his property. He abandoned Valyria with his entire family. And he settled on a small island off the coast of Westeros. Dragonstone. To most of the Valyrian nobility, the decision was incomprehensible. Why leave the richest city in the world to live in a remote fortress at the edge of a foreign continent? For years, the Targaryens became the subject of ridicule. No one imagined that this single decision would ensure the survival of their entire bloodline. Then came the day that changed history forever. The chronicles remember it by a single name: the Doom of Valyria. No complete account of what happened has ever survived. The few testimonies that remain speak of volcanic eruptions, devastating earthquakes, and seas that began to boil. The 14 Flames erupted almost simultaneously. The earth split apart. Entire cities disappeared beneath rivers of molten rock. The magnificent palaces of the Dragon Lords were destroyed within hours. Thousands died with no chance of escape. The dragons that remained on the peninsula vanished as well. What had stood for centuries as the center of the known world simply ceased to exist. It is difficult to find any event in history worthy of comparison. If the fall of the Roman Empire transformed Europe over the course of centuries, the doom of Valyria reshaped the political balance of the known world in a single day. The greatest empire in history simply disappeared. Trade routes collapsed. The colonies lost all contact with the heart of the freehold. Nearly every ruling Dragon Lord family was wiped out. And the immense vacuum of power was gradually filled by new rising powers. From that day forward, very few dared return to the old peninsula. Sailors spoke of black waters, smoking ruins, and strange creatures lurking among the shattered remains of the empire. The region came to be known as the Smoking Sea. Even centuries later, it remained one of the most feared places in the known world. Only one family of dragon riders had survived: the Targaryens. From the safety of Dragonstone, they watched as the civilization that had given birth to their world vanished forever. Without ever intending it, they had become the last heirs of Valyria. And that circumstance would one day change the destiny of Westeros itself. The fall of Valyria transformed the balance of the world almost overnight. Cities that had spent centuries under the rule of the freehold suddenly found themselves standing alone. Some declared their independence. Others began competing with one another for trade, wealth, and influence. None was powerful enough to replace the old empire. Yet together, they inherited much of its prosperity and its culture. Meanwhile, on Dragonstone, the Targaryens found themselves in an unexpectedly privileged position. They were no longer a minor family within a vast empire. They were the last surviving Dragon Lords. They had preserved their knowledge. They had preserved their bloodline. And, most importantly of all, they had preserved their dragons. For nearly a century, they remained on Dragonstone without attempting to conquer Westeros. It is a surprisingly restrained chapter of their history. With the overwhelming military advantage they possessed, they could have launched an invasion much earlier. Instead, the Targaryens spent those years strengthening their position, preserving the legacy of Valyria, and adapting to a world utterly different from the one their ancestors had known. Across the narrow sea, Westeros remained divided. The ancient kingdoms that had emerged during the Age of Heroes still endured. Each had its own laws, its own rulers, its own rivalries. In the north, the Starks ruled from Winterfell. In the west, the Lannisters held Casterly Rock. House Gardener controlled the fertile lands of the Reach. House Durrandon continued to rule from Storm's End. The Arryns governed the Vale. The Martells strengthened their authority in Dorne. And the Riverlands changed hands again and again, serving as the battleground for the ambitions of neighboring kingdoms. There was no concept of Westeros as a single nation. It was a continent of independent realms, each competing for land, resources, and prestige. Some wars lasted for years. Others endured for entire generations. Alliances shifted constantly. Marriages between noble houses were arranged as often to secure peace as to prepare for the next inevitable conflict. It was an unstable balance. Yet for thousands of years, it had endured. Few could even imagine another way for the continent to exist. But on Dragonstone, a young man was coming of age who had inherited far more than the blood of old Valyria. He had inherited a different vision of power. His name was Aegon Targaryen. Alongside his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, he commanded 3 dragons unlike anything Westeros had ever seen. Balerion, the Black Dread, was the greatest of them all. Vaga embodied decades of strength, experience, and battle-hardened power. Meraxes ruled the skies with a speed and majesty capable of inspiring fear before a battle had even begun. 4 years, Aegon looked across the narrow sea toward the divided continent beyond. He did not simply see 7 rival kingdoms. He saw an opportunity that would forever change the history of Westeros. When Aegon Targaryen turned his gaze toward Westeros, the continent had been divided for thousands of years. To its people, that division was simply the natural order of things. Kings were born, ruled, and died without ever imagining that any authority could exist above their own crown. The north answered to the Starks, the west to the Lannisters, the Reach to the Gardeners, the Stormlands to House Durrandon, the Vale to the Arryns, Dorne to the Martells, and the Riverlands endured the rule of Harren the Black, a king whose ambition had already begun to reshape the balance of power across the continent. Each kingdom had its own laws, its own army, its own ambitions. War was an accepted instrument of politics. There was no shared capital, no common currency, no single identity. Aegon understood that such division made lasting stability impossible. Borders shifted constantly. Alliances were broken almost as quickly as they were forged. Each generation inherited conflicts that seemed destined never to end. But there was another reason as well. The Targaryens could never return to Valyria. Their ancient homeland was gone forever. If they were to build a new legacy, it would have to be somewhere else. And nowhere offered greater possibilities than Westeros. Before launching his campaign, Aegon did something that reveals a great deal about the way he thought. He did not immediately land with his armies. He studied the continent first. He examined the relationships between its kingdoms. He identified Harren the Black's enemies. He learned which houses carried ancient rivalries. He noted which rulers had been weakened by recent wars. He understood that conquest depended on more than military strength. It also depended upon choosing exactly the right moment. When he was ready, Aegon sent his message to the kings of Westeros. Its terms were straightforward. Those who accepted his rule would keep their lands, their titles, and much of their authority. Those who refused would face the dragons. Most rejected the offer. It was hardly a surprising response. From their perspective, Aegon was little more than a foreign lord living on a small island off their eastern coast. No king whose family had ruled for generations would willingly surrender a crown to a man who had never even set foot upon the continent. That decision would lead to one of the most famous military campaigns in the history of Westeros. In the year that would later become known as 1 AC, after the conquest, Aegon crossed the narrow sea alongside his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys. He did not command the largest army on the continent, but he commanded the most feared. Marching with thousands of soldiers were Balerion, Vaga, and Meraxes. 3 dragons. 3 living weapons capable of deciding the outcome of a battle before it had even begun. The place Aegon chose for his landing was no accident. It was a modest rise overlooking the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, positioned almost at the very center of Westeros. From there, he could strike in any direction against the great kingdoms. The camp they raised was little more than timber walls and wooden palisades, insignificant beside the ancient fortresses that already dotted the continent. Yet over the centuries, that humble encampment would grow into the most important city in all the seven kingdoms. King's Landing. But no one standing there could have imagined it. It was only the first step in a conquest that was about to reshape the history of Westeros forever. The first campaigns unfolded with remarkable speed. Aegon understood that he could not afford to wage a long war against all seven kingdoms at once. His strategy was simple: defeat each opponent before the others could unite in a coordinated response. His first major target was Harren the Black. 4 years, Harren had forced thousands of men to build the greatest fortress Westeros had ever seen. Harrenhal. Its walls were immense. Its towers seemed impossible to bring down. And its lord believed that no army in the world could ever conquer it. When Aegon offered him the chance to surrender, Harren chose instead to shelter behind those colossal stone walls. From every previous lesson in history, it was a logical decision. For thousands of years, fortresses had been the ultimate form of defense. But Harren was fighting an old war against an entirely new enemy. As the Targaryen army surrounded the castle, Valyrian slowly rose above its towering walls. He did not need to break through them. He simply flew over them. The Black Dread's fire poured onto the towers, the courtyards, and the great halls within. The stone endured. Those inside did not. Harren and much of his family perished that very night. Even today, the blackened walls of Harrenhal still bear the scars of the unimaginable heat that twisted their stone nearly 3 centuries ago. It was a demonstration no ruler could ignore. For the first time, every king in Westeros understood that castles no longer guaranteed a monarch's safety. Meanwhile, 2 of the greatest armies on the continent agreed to stand together. King Mern IX Gardener of the Reach and King Loren Lannister of the Rock realized that only an alliance offered any hope of stopping the invaders. Together, they assembled tens of thousands of soldiers. It was, in all likelihood, the largest army Westeros had ever seen. They believed that overwhelming numbers would outweigh the advantage of dragons. The armies met upon a vast plain that history would remember by an unforgettable name: the Field of Fire. Thousands of men marched forward convinced they were fighting the battle that would decide the future of the continent. Then the dragons appeared. Valyrian, Vagar, Meraxes. Flames swept across the battlefield from every direction. The dry grass ignited almost instantly. Smoke swallowed the horizon. The formation of the great allied army collapsed within minutes. Never before had so many men been defeated so quickly. King Mern fell in battle alongside much of the ancient House Gardener. With him ended a dynasty that had ruled the Reach for thousands of years. Loren Lannister understood that continuing the fight would accomplish nothing except more death. He chose to surrender. Aegon accepted his oath and allowed him to remain Lord of the West. Once again, the decision revealed Aegon's true strategy. He did not intend to destroy the great houses of Westeros. He intended to rule them. The Lannisters remained masters of their lands. But now they ruled beneath a new crown. It was a far wiser policy than replacing every ruler with foreign nobles. More and more lords began to realize that accepting Aegon's authority might allow their families to preserve nearly everything they had spent generations building. The conquest was advancing with a speed few would have believed possible. And yet 2 decisions still lay ahead, decisions that would forever shape the history of Westeros. One would be made by a king who chose to kneel. The other by a kingdom that would never accept conquest. The next decision belonged to the king in the north. Torrhen Stark gathered his armies and marched south, prepared to defend the independence of his kingdom. For thousands of years, the Starks had borne the title of Kings of Winter, answering to no crown but their own. His men were ready to fight. They knew the hardships of the north. They had survived winters that the southern kingdoms could scarcely imagine. But when the northern host reached the banks of the Trident and saw Aegon's 3 dragons resting beside his camp, Torrhen understood that this war would be unlike any that had come before. He could fight. He could even die with honor. What he could not guarantee was the survival of his people. That night, he gathered his closest advisors and the greatest lords of the north. History does not preserve what was said in that council. Only the outcome remains. The following morning, Torrhen Stark crossed the river, laid down his crown, and swore fealty to Aegon Targaryen. From that day forward, he would be remembered as the king who knelt. For centuries, some dismissed him as a coward. Others, especially in the north, came to see his choice very differently. While other kingdoms had been devastated by dragon fire, the north kept its cities, its castles, and the overwhelming majority of its people. Torrhen surrendered a crown to save a kingdom. It was a political decision far more difficult than history often acknowledges. Only one great realm still remained beyond Aegon's rule: Dorne. If the rest of Westeros had demonstrated the power of dragons, Dorne would reveal the limits of that power. From the very beginning, House Martell understood that meeting Aegon in open battle would be a mistake. They never assembled one great army. They never defended every castle to the last man. Instead, they chose an entirely different strategy. Whenever the Targaryens reached a fortress, they found it abandoned. Whenever they occupied a town, its people had already vanished. The Dornish avoided pitched battles, striking only when the advantage was theirs. They ambushed isolated detachments. They cut supply lines. They disappeared into mountains and deserts long before the dragons could reach them. It was a war of attrition. A war in which capturing a castle did not mean controlling the land around it. Aegon succeeded in occupying much of Dorne, but he never truly ruled it. Every victory seemed to dissolve only days after it had been won. In time, he realized that the campaign demanded greater and greater sacrifices while yielding less and less in return. Dorne would remain independent for nearly 2 more centuries. It was the one great exception on a continent that had otherwise been transformed forever. For the first time in history, 6 of the great kingdoms answered to a single sovereign. The political map of Westeros was no longer defined by rival crowns. A new realm had been born. And Aegon wanted a symbol that would remind everyone how it had come into existence. It was not meant to be beautiful. It was meant to command respect. And, when necessary, fear. So began the forging of the Iron Throne. The Iron Throne was never intended to be a work of art. It was intended to be a reminder. Aegon ordered the swords of the defeated kings and the lords who had sworn him fealty to be gathered together. According to tradition, those blades were melted by the fire of Valyria and forged into a single towering seat. The result was anything but comfortable. It was uneven, jagged, dangerous. To sit upon it was to accept that ruling should never become an act of comfort. In time, a saying would pass from one generation to the next. A king who grew too comfortable upon the Iron Throne was a king who had forgotten the weight of his responsibilities. Around that symbol, a new city slowly began to rise. What had once been a simple military camp beside the Blackwater Rush expanded year by year. Merchants arrived. Craftsmen, builders, sailors, officials. With each passing year came new streets, new docks, and new marketplaces. Though it had never been planned that way from the beginning, King's Landing gradually became the political heart of the continent. From there, a kingdom unlike any before it would be governed. Aegon understood, however, that conquest was only the first step. The true challenge was holding together a realm so vast and so diverse. For that reason, he avoided changing what already worked. The great houses kept their ancestral domains. The Starks continued to rule the north. The Arryns remained lords of the Vale. The Lannisters retained the Westerlands. The Baratheons, descendants of Orys Baratheon, took possession of Storm's End after the fall of House Durrandon. The Tyrells were granted the Reach following the extinction of House Gardener. Rather than tearing down the existing order, Aegon built a new one upon its foundations. It was a formula that reduced the likelihood of rebellion while making it easier to integrate former enemies into a single realm. Naturally, not every difference disappeared. The North continued to worship the old gods. Much of the South remained devoted to the faith of the Seven. Customs, laws, and even ideas of honor varied enormously from one region to another. To rule Westeros meant accepting that diversity, not imposing a single identity upon it. Perhaps that is why Aegon spent much of his reign traveling across the continent. He visited castles. He listened to local lords. He settled disputes. And he reminded everyone that, although they retained much of their autonomy, a single authority now stood above them all. It was a delicate balance. Too much power in the hands of the great lords could fracture the realm once again. Too much authority concentrated in the crown could spark new wars. For decades, the system endured. But the greatest challenge still lay ahead. Because no kingdom depends upon its founder alone. Sooner or later, every dynasty must face the same question. What happens when the man who created the realm is gone? The answer would begin to unfold through the children and grandchildren of Aegon, a family destined to discover that preserving an empire could prove far more difficult than conquering one. The death of Aegon I did not bring about the immediate collapse of the Seven Kingdoms. Perhaps that was his greatest achievement. He had built a system capable of surviving its founder. Yet the true strength of a dynasty is never measured during the reign of a great conqueror, but when power passes into the hands of the next generation. His son, Aenys I, inherited the crown at what appeared to be a peaceful moment. The great kingdoms remained united. No foreign invasions threatened the realm. The dragons were still the most formidable weapon in the known world. And yet, the new king quickly discovered that peace could be far more difficult to govern than war. Aenys was a very different man from his father. Where Aegon inspired obedience with scarcely a word, Aenys preferred dialogue and reconciliation. He sought to avoid conflict whenever possible. It was an admirable quality in any man, but not necessarily in a monarch whose authority was still being tested. The first rebellion soon emerged. Some lords believed the new king was too weak. Others argued that the unity of Westeros had existed only because of Aegon's extraordinary presence, and that with the conqueror gone, the time had come to reclaim their independence. To those political tensions was added an even more delicate conflict. The faith of the Seven had begun to view the customs of House Targaryen with growing alarm. For generations, the Dragon Lords had practiced marriage between brother and sister to preserve the purity of their bloodline. It was a tradition inherited from old Valyria. But to the faith, such unions were a grave sin. What had long remained beneath the surface finally erupted into open confrontation. Every decision the king made came under closer scrutiny. Every concession was interpreted as another sign of weakness. And the harder he tried to avoid conflict, the more impossible it became to contain. While Aenys hesitated, another figure began to draw every eye. His half-brother, Maegor Targaryen. The son of Aegon and Visenya, Maegor embodied almost everything Aenys was not. He was a feared warrior, an accomplished dragon rider, and a man convinced that authority could be preserved only through strength. Many admired him for the very qualities that others found terrifying. In times of uncertainty, decisive men often inspire more confidence than cautious ones. The distance between the two brothers continued to grow. With every new crisis, the feeling deepened that the realm was moving toward an unavoidable reckoning. The question was no longer simply who should wear the crown. It ran far deeper than that. What did the Seven Kingdoms truly need in order to survive? A conciliatory king, willing to listen to every voice? Or a ruler prepared to impose order by whatever means were necessary? It was a question that would divide House Targaryen from its earliest years. And before long, it would receive an answer so violent that the continent would take generations to forget its consequences. The death of Aegon I did not bring about the immediate collapse of the Seven Kingdoms. Perhaps that was his greatest achievement. He had built a system capable of surviving its founder. Yet the true strength of any dynasty is never measured during the reign of a great conqueror, but when power passes into the hands of the next generation. His son, Aenys I, inherited the crown at what appeared to be a time of peace. The great kingdoms remained united. No foreign invasions threatened the realm. The dragons were still the most powerful weapon in the known world. And yet the new king quickly discovered that governing peace could be far more difficult than waging war. Aenys was a very different man from his father. Where Aegon inspired obedience almost without speaking, Aenys preferred dialogue and reconciliation. Whenever possible, he sought to avoid conflict. It was an admirable quality in any man, but not necessarily in a monarch whose authority was still being tested. The first rebellions did not take long to emerge. Some lords believed the new king was too weak. Others argued that the unity of Westeros had existed only because of Aegon's extraordinary presence, and that with the conqueror gone, the time had come to reclaim their independence. Those political tensions were soon joined by an even more delicate conflict. The faith of the Seven watched the customs of House Targaryen with growing concern. For generations, the Dragon Lords had practiced marriage between brother and sister to preserve the purity of their bloodline. It was a tradition inherited from old Valyria. But to the faith, such unions were a grave sin. What had lingered beneath the surface for years finally erupted into open confrontation. Every decision the king made was scrutinized more harshly than the last. Every concession was interpreted as another sign of weakness. And the more desperately Aenys tried to avoid conflict, the more impossible it became to prevent it. While Aenys hesitated, another figure began to command the attention of the realm. His half-brother, Maegor Targaryen. The son of Aegon and Visenya, Maegor embodied almost everything Aenys was not. He was a feared warrior, an accomplished dragon rider, and a man utterly convinced that authority could only be maintained through strength. Many admired him for precisely the qualities that others feared. In times of uncertainty, decisive personalities often inspire greater confidence than cautious ones. The distance between the two brothers continued to widen. Each new crisis strengthened the growing sense that the kingdom was moving toward an unavoidable reckoning. The question was no longer simply who ought to wear the crown. It ran far deeper than that. What did the Seven Kingdoms truly need in order to survive? A conciliatory king, willing to listen to every voice? Or a ruler prepared to impose order by whatever means were necessary? That question would divide House Targaryen from its earliest years. And before long, it would receive an answer so violent that the continent would take generations to forget its consequences. The situation eventually slipped beyond Aenys' control. Rebellions multiplied across the realm. The authority of the crown was challenged in every corner of the kingdom. And the faith of the Seven condemned the customs of House Targaryen with ever greater determination. The king seemed incapable of restoring order. Decisions were delayed. Commands came too late. Even those who remained loyal began to lose confidence. In the end, Aenys died after a brief and deeply troubled reign. His death left behind a question that no one could answer without risking the stability of the Seven Kingdoms. Who should now sit upon the Iron Throne? By every law of succession, the rightful heir was the young Prince Aegon, the late king's son. But Maegor possessed something no other claimant could offer: military experience, a fearsome dragon, and the unwavering resolve to act without hesitation. With the support of his mother, Queen Visenya, he returned to Westeros and claimed the crown. Not everyone accepted his claim. Many of the great lords defended the rights of Aenys' son. The faith also refused to recognize the new king. What began as a dispute over succession soon became a struggle for the very soul of the realm. Maegor responded in the only way he knew: with force. Every rebellion was crushed with ruthless efficiency. Every challenge was met with uncompromising violence. To some, that severity restored the stability the crown so desperately needed. To others, it marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in Targaryen history. In time, he would earn a name that perfectly captured his legacy: Maegor the Cruel. It was not a title bestowed only by his enemies. Even those who acknowledged his ability as a ruler admitted that few kings had relied upon violence so readily. His conflict with the faith reached unprecedented levels. The warriors' sons and the poor fellows, the military orders sworn to defend the faith, rose in open rebellion against the crown. For years, the roads of Westeros became battlegrounds where the king's soldiers fought men who believed they were carrying out the will of the gods. It was more than a war between two armies. It was a clash between two fundamentally different visions of authority. On one side stood a monarchy demanding absolute obedience. On the other stood a religious institution convinced that even a king must answer to a higher law. Maegor was determined to prove that no power could stand above the Iron Throne. His military victory was undeniable. The rebellions were crushed. The leaders of the resistance were killed or driven into exile. The crown regained control of the realm. But every victory left another scar behind. Fear could impose silence. It could not always inspire loyalty. At the same time, the king began constructing a fortress intended to symbolize the permanence of his dynasty. Upon the highest hill in King's Landing, an enormous stronghold slowly rose. The Red Keep. It was far more than a royal palace. It was a declaration of power. Immense walls, sprawling courtyards, towering keeps, and hidden passageways took shape over many years, transforming the fortress into the true political heart of Westeros. Yet as the castle grew, so did an unsettling legend. It was said that whenever certain sections were completed, Maegor ordered many of the builders who had worked on them to be executed. In that way, no one would ever know every secret hidden within its corridors and underground tunnels. Perhaps we will never know how much truth lies behind those stories. But the fact that they were so easily believed says a great deal about the image the king had created for himself. Yet Jaehaerys' greatest legacy cannot be understood without speaking of the woman who ruled beside him, Queen Alysanne. History often remembers great kings while relegating those who shared their decisions to the background. But in this case, it would be impossible to understand that remarkable era without recognizing the influence of the good Queen Alysanne. While Jaehaerys traveled the realm settling disputes among the great lords, Alysanne devoted much of her time to learning about the lives of those who rarely found a place in the history books. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, women whose voices seldom reached the royal court. Listening to their stories changed many of the decisions made during the reign. She championed reforms designed to improve the administration of justice. She intervened to protect the most vulnerable. And she used her position not to accumulate power for herself, but to make the crown feel closer to those who lived far from King's Landing. She was also a remarkable traveler. Unlike many members of the royal family, she did not spend long stretches confined within the Red Keep. She journeyed through nearly every corner of Westeros. Even the north, a land that many southern rulers scarcely knew. When she reached the wall, she was profoundly moved. Not only by its immense scale, but by the lives of the men who guarded it. The Night's Watch still defended a frontier whose importance many in the south had begun to forget. The long centuries of peace had reduced the White Walkers to little more than figures from ancient tales. Yet the wall still stood. And so did the men who devoted their entire lives to defending it. Alysanne understood the hardships they endured. She persuaded the king to strengthen the crown's support for the Night's Watch and to grant it new lands, ensuring the order would have the resources needed to sustain itself for generations. At the time, it seemed like a solution to a relatively minor problem. Yet centuries later, when the North once again faced the ancient dangers beyond the wall, many would remember the importance of those measures. Jaehaerys' long reign allowed an entire generation to grow up without experiencing a great civil war. The roads remained open. Trade flourished. Granaries were full after plentiful harvests. The cities slowly expanded. For the first time since the Conquest, many people throughout Westeros began to believe that such peace might last forever. But history rarely grants lasting stability. As the years passed, the very success of Jaehaerys' reign gave rise to an unexpected problem. House Targaryen continued to grow. Princes, princesses, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Each new birth strengthened the dynasty, and at the same time, made the question of succession ever more complicated. Who should inherit the Iron Throne when the time finally came? While Jaehaerys was still in his prime, that question could be postponed. But the years marched on. Some of his children died before him. Others relinquished their claims. And with every loss, the line of succession had to be reconsidered once again. What had seemed for decades to be little more than a private family matter gradually became the greatest political challenge of his reign. Without intending to, the aging king was preparing the stage for one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. A decision that sought to prevent a war, but instead planted the seeds of the most devastating conflict House Targaryen would ever endure. When Viserys I ascended the Iron Throne, few imagined that his reign would be remembered as the prelude to a devastating civil war. The chroniclers described those years as an age of prosperity. The dragons continued to multiply. Wealth flowed in from every corner of the continent. The great houses maintained, at least on the surface, a stable relationship with the crown. It was the reward for decades of peace. And precisely because of that, many began to believe such stability would last forever. Viserys was an amiable man. He delighted in feasts, tournaments, and family gatherings. He preferred to settle disagreements through conversation rather than threats. He had inherited a strong kingdom and was determined to preserve it exactly as he had received it. But some conflicts do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They merely wait for the right moment to grow. The first arose after the death of Queen Aemma Arryn. The loss deeply affected the king. But it also opened a political question of enormous importance. Viserys had no surviving son to succeed him. In an extraordinary decision for the time, he declared his daughter his heir, Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen. The great lords of the realm came to swear their loyalty. One after another, they pledged to recognize her rights when the time came. The ceremony appeared to settle the matter of succession once and for all. History, however, is rarely so straightforward. Years later, Viserys married again. His new queen was Alicent Hightower, daughter of one of the most powerful families in the realm. The marriage produced several children. Among them was a son named Aegon. And with his birth, a question many believed had already been answered returned once more. Now that there was a male heir, should Rhaenyra remain the chosen successor? Viserys answered without hesitation. Yes. He never removed his daughter from the line of succession. He continued to present her as the future queen. He seated her beside him during official ceremonies. And he required the great lords to renew the oaths of loyalty they had sworn to her years before. But while the king remained steadfast in his decision, the court itself began to divide. Not openly. Not yet. It happened in quieter ways. At every feast, every tournament, every meeting of the small council, the loyalties of those around the king became increasingly clear. Some insisted that the king's will must be honored and that Rhaenyra was the rightful heir. Others argued that tradition unmistakably favored Prince Aegon. In time, the two factions came to be known by the colors they wore during a royal celebration. Alicent's supporters adopted the green of House Hightower. Rhaenyra's followers embraced the black and red of House Targaryen. Thus were born the Greens and the Blacks. They still lived beneath the same roof. They still belonged to the same family. But every conversation now concealed a political calculation. Every marriage strengthened one faction or the other. Every birth altered the delicate balance of power. Without fully realizing it, the family that possessed more dragons than any other in history had begun to fracture from within. And no threat is more dangerous than the one born in the very heart of a kingdom. The differences between the two factions were never simply about the question of succession. As the years passed, they came to represent two very different visions for the future of the dynasty. Rhaenyra had grown up believing that one day she would sit upon the Iron Throne. She had accompanied her father to meetings of the small council. She knew the great lords of the realm. She had learned the delicate balance that held the seven kingdoms together. On Dragonstone, where she lived with her family, many of the ancient Valyrian traditions continued to be preserved. Alicent, however, viewed the situation through an entirely different lens. She was the mother of the king's sons. To her, it was difficult to accept that those princes should stand behind their half-sister in the line of succession. Around her stood experienced men such as her father, Otto Hightower, reinforcing that belief. Otto had served for many years as Hand of the King. Few understood the machinery of power better than he did. And he was convinced that a disputed succession would inevitably lead to war. Ironically, the very decisions intended to prevent that conflict only drew it closer. Meanwhile, a new generation of princes and princesses was coming of age. Rhaenyra's children. Alicent's children. All of them carried the blood of old Valyria. All rode dragons, or dreamed of doing so one day. But the childhood that had begun with games and training gradually gave way to a life overshadowed by suspicion. The rivalries of the adults found an inevitable reflection in the younger generation. Every family disagreement left its mark. Every comparison nurtured fresh resentment. And, as so often happens within powerful families throughout history, private wounds eventually carried public consequences. One episode, more than any other, came to symbolize that growing divide. It took place after the funeral of Lena Valerian. While the family gathered to mourn one of their own, another event unfolded that would permanently alter the balance among the young Targaryens. Vaga, the oldest and most formidable dragon in the world, had been left riderless. Under the cover of night, Prince Aemond, Alicent's son, approached the enormous beast alone. It was an extraordinarily dangerous decision. No one could force a dragon to accept a new rider. The bond existed only if the dragon chose to allow it. Against all expectation, Vaga accepted the boy. In the space of a single night, Aemond went from being the only one of his siblings without a dragon, to the rider of the greatest living dragon in the world. The event profoundly changed the relationship between the young princes. Not long afterward, a fight broke out. What began as a heated argument soon turned into a violent struggle. Wooden practice swords gave way to stones. Threats became tangled with fear. And in the midst of the fight, Aemond lost an eye. The physical wound never fully healed. But the emotional one ran far deeper. From that day onward, the prince wore a sapphire in place of the eye he had lost. It was an image impossible to forget, and a constant reminder that reconciliation between the two branches of House Targaryen was becoming increasingly unlikely. By the time the children had grown into adults and taken their place in the affairs of the realm, they had inherited far more than dragons. They had inherited years of accumulated resentment. And every one of them believed that history would ultimately prove them right. As tensions continued to grow within the royal family, Viserys clung to a single hope. He believed that the affection shared by his children and grandchildren would ultimately prove stronger than any political rivalry. Whenever conflict arose, he arranged another feast. He gathered the family together once more. He reminded them that they shared the same blood. For a few brief hours, those gatherings seemed to succeed. Smiles returned. Goblets were raised. Musicians filled the halls of the Red Keep. But beneath that appearance of harmony, old grievances continued to accumulate. Every gesture of kindness concealed a measure of distrust. Every toast carried an unspoken question about the future. Viserys aged rapidly. Illness gradually weakened the body that had borne the weight of the crown for so many years. Little by little, he appeared less often at public ceremonies. The daily affairs of the realm increasingly passed into the hands of his advisors. And, almost without the kingdom noticing, the center of power began to shift toward those waiting to inherit it. The court no longer debated matters of governance alone. Every conversation revolved around a single question. What would happen on the day the king died? Rhaenyra's supporters remained convinced that the oath sworn years before had to be honored. The Greens argued that a male heir offered a more secure succession and would spare the realm future disputes. Both factions insisted they were acting for the good of the kingdom. And both were equally certain that the other was leading Westeros toward disaster. It was an especially dangerous situation because neither side was willing to yield. The dragons, which for generations had guaranteed House Targaryen's supremacy over the continent, were now divided among members of the same family. For the first time since the Conquest, there existed the possibility that those creatures would not be fighting foreign enemies, but one another. It was almost unthinkable. The dragons had united Westeros. Now they had the power to destroy it. At last, Viserys' long reign came to an end. His death marked the very moment so many had tried to avoid for decades. Yet the most decisive event was not the king's passing itself. It was what happened immediately afterward. Instead of publicly announcing the monarch's death and summoning Rhaenyra, the leading members of the small council gathered in secret. The doors remained closed. Messengers were closely watched. No one was permitted to leave the Red Keep without authorization. Within that chamber, a decision was made that would forever alter the history of the Seven Kingdoms. The councillors closest to Alicent and Otto Hightower proclaimed Prince Aegon king. They acted swiftly. They knew that every passing hour increased the chance that Rhaenyra would rally her own supporters. Meanwhile, on Dragonstone, the woman whom Viserys had publicly declared his heir still knew nothing of her father's death. Nor did she know that another crown was already being prepared. The war had not yet begun. But peace had come to an end. And for the first time in history, the dragons were about to wage war against one another. The news reached Dragonstone bearing the weight of a double tragedy. Viserys was dead, and another man already sat upon the Iron Throne. To Rhaenyra, the two could not be separated. She had not only lost her father, she had also watched the oaths the great lords had sworn to her over so many years cast aside in a matter of hours. The princess's supporters reacted swiftly. On Dragonstone, the nobles who still recognized her claim began gathering around her. Ravens took flight for every corner of the continent. Each message forced its recipient to make an impossible choice. Stand beside the new crown established in King's Landing, or honor the oath once sworn to Viserys' daughter. Neither choice came without consequences. Many great houses discovered that their own members stood on opposite sides. Fathers argued with sons. Brothers chose different paths. Old friendships were shattered by a question that no longer allowed for compromise. Meanwhile, Rhaenyra was crowned on Dragonstone with the ancient circlet that had once belonged to Aegon the Conqueror. It was more than a ceremony. It was a declaration of legitimacy. If the Greens proclaimed Aegon II as king, the Blacks answered by proclaiming Rhaenyra as queen. From that moment onward, there were two crowns, two governments, and two completely different interpretations of who truly embodied the rightful continuation of the dynasty. War had become inevitable. Even so, for a few brief days, there were still those who tried to prevent it. Messages were exchanged. Settlements were proposed. Some suggested dividing territories. Others advocated new marriages that might reconcile the two branches of the family. But the wounds left by so many years of resentment ran too deep. Distrust outweighed every promise. Then came the event that extinguished any remaining hope of negotiation. Prince Lucerys Valerian, one of Rhaenyra's sons, was sent to Storm's End to secure the support of House Baratheon. It was a diplomatic mission. According to ancient custom, envoys were to be respected even in times of rising tension. But there he encountered Aemon Targaryen, the very prince who had lost an eye years before. Two boys whose lives had once been defined by a childhood fight had become men mounted upon two of the most powerful dragons in the world. When Lucerys departed the castle on the back of Arrax, Aemon chose to pursue him atop Vhagar. What happened next remains shrouded in conflicting accounts. Some believe Aemon intended only to frighten him. Others are convinced he sought revenge from the very beginning. Only one fact is beyond dispute. High above a raging storm, the dragons ceased to obey their riders completely. The ancient bond between dragon and rider revealed that it, too, had its limits. Vhagar attacked. Arrax responded on instinct. And within moments, the oldest dragon in Westeros tore the youngest apart. The remains of Lucerys vanished into the storm-tossed sea below. With his death, every hope of reconciliation disappeared. This was no longer a dispute over succession. It had become a war of blood. A war in which every loss would demand another. And one in which the dragons, long the greatest symbol of Targaryen power, would begin to serve as the instruments of their own destruction. As the months passed, the war no longer distinguished between victor and vanquished. Every triumph demanded an unbearable price. The great houses lost their heirs. Armies returned with far fewer men than had marched to war. And the dragons, which for generations had embodied the permanence of Targaryen power, disappeared one by one. Perhaps the greatest mistake made by both sides was forgetting that these creatures were not merely weapons. They were extraordinary living beings whose survival depended upon a delicate balance that had been built over centuries. Every dragon that died diminished the chances of the species enduring. Yet in the midst of war, few had the luxury of thinking about the future. Only the next battle mattered. Only the next victory. At last, the Blacks succeeded in taking King's Landing. Rhaenyra entered the city she had believed her entire life was destined to become her home as queen. After so many years of uncertainty, she finally took her place upon the Iron Throne. But the moment she had awaited for decades felt nothing like a celebration. She inherited a capital exhausted by war. The royal treasury was all but empty. Its people were weary of heavy taxes, shortages, and endless rumors. Ruling a peaceful kingdom was difficult enough. Ruling one in the midst of civil war was almost impossible. Before long, Rhaenyra's decisions began to breed resentment. To sustain the war effort, greater burdens had to be placed upon the people. Food became scarce. Prices continued to rise. Fear mingled with frustration. The queen, who had once been seen by many as the rightful hope of the succession, gradually began to lose the support of the common people. Meanwhile, Aegon too was still alive. Though gravely wounded, he remained a rallying point for those who rejected the rule of his half-sister. The war was far from over. Then something happened that no one had foreseen. It was not the work of an enemy army, nor the result of some brilliant military strategy. It came from the people of King's Landing themselves. Driven by hunger, fear, and religious fervor, an angry mob rose against the dragons. The creatures that had been admired for generations now came to be seen as the source of every misfortune that had befallen the realm. The crowd marched upon the dragon pit. What followed was as chaotic as it was tragic. Men and women armed with little more than torches, axes, and ordinary tools forced their way into the vast structure where several dragons were being kept. Many were consumed by dragon fire. Others were crushed beneath collapsing stone. Yet the fury of the mob ultimately prevailed. One after another, several dragons perished within the dragon pit. The event marked a point of no return. For more than a century, the dragons had seemed inseparable from Targaryen rule. Now even the common people had proven that they could be killed. When the smoke finally cleared, it was not only some of the world's most extraordinary creatures that had vanished. The myth of their invincibility had vanished with them. From that moment onward, the dance of the dragons ceased to be merely a civil war. It became the beginning of the end for the species that had built the Valyrian freehold and conquered the Seven Kingdoms. Neither side could yet grasp the true magnitude of that loss. History, however, would remember it. For when the war finally came to an end, House Targaryen would endure. The dragons, however, would never be the same again. The war ended as the fiercest civil wars so often do. There were no true victors, only survivors. Rhaenyra never succeeded in securing the power she had claimed for so many years. Forced to abandon King's Landing, she began a desperate retreat as support for her cause slowly crumbled away. Exhaustion had reached everyone. The great lords were weary. The royal treasury remained empty. The fields still failed to produce enough food to feed the realm. Even those who had fought with the greatest conviction began to wonder whether the war still had any purpose. The end came in the cruelest way imaginable. Rhaenyra was captured by the forces of Aegon II. Her fate was sealed. Before the eyes of her own son, the queen was executed by the dragon Sunfire. The scene was forever etched into the memories of those who witnessed it. It was not only a claimant to the Iron Throne who perished. It was a daughter of Westeros, a mother, a woman whose entire life had been shaped, from childhood onward, by the promise of a crown. Her death did not bring an end to the suffering. The war continued for some time still. But by then, the conflict had already consumed nearly everything both sides had fought to preserve. Aegon too retained the title of king. Yet his victory scarcely resembled one. The wounds he had suffered during the war steadily eroded his health. Many members of his family were dead. Most of the dragons had vanished. The realm remained divided and impoverished. Months later, Aegon II himself died under circumstances that were never fully explained. Some spoke of illness. Others suspected he had been poisoned by those who believed that the only path back to peace was to bring that bitter generation's struggle to a final end. As with so many moments in history, the truth disappeared beneath conflicting accounts. What truly mattered was what happened afterward. The crown passed to Aegon III, Rhaenyra's son. The grandson of the very ruler the victorious faction had spent the entire war fighting against. It was an irony that could not be ignored. After so many years of destruction, the realm ultimately accepted as its king a direct descendant of both rival factions. Perhaps it was the only possible solution. The young king had witnessed horrors no child should ever endure. He had watched his mother die. He had grown up surrounded by betrayal, fire, and war. It is hardly surprising that the chronicles describe him as a man profoundly shaped by those memories. History would remember him by a sorrowful name, Aegon the Unhappy. During his reign, another event permanently altered the destiny of House Targaryen. The last dragons began to die. Some were simply too weak to survive. Others hatched smaller and frailer with each new generation. Until, at last, the final known dragon drew its last breath. With it ended an age that had begun thousands of years earlier among the 14 flames of Valyria. For the first time since the founding of the Valyrian freehold, no dragons remained to soar through the skies. The Targaryens kept the Iron Throne. They kept their name. They kept the crown. But they had lost the one thing that had truly made them unique. From that moment forward, they remained a powerful dynasty, but no longer an invincible one. And that difference, almost imperceptible at first, would ultimately shape the destiny of the Seven Kingdoms for centuries to come. When the last dragon died, many believed that only an extraordinary species had vanished. In truth, what disappeared was the very foundation upon which the power of House Targaryen had been built. For more than a century, no great lord had openly challenged the dynasty because everyone knew that, in the end, there were always the dragons. They could crush a rebellion, reduce a castle to ashes, decide the outcome of a war within hours. Without them, the Targaryen kings still wore the crown. But they ruled no differently than any other great noble family. They depended on alliances, on marriages, on the loyalty of the great houses, and above all, on their own ability to govern. That marked the beginning of a very different age. The chroniclers often devote fewer pages to these reigns because they lack sweeping conquests or spectacular battles. Yet they were decades of profound importance. It was the moment when the kingdom created by Aegon had to prove it could endure without the very power that had made it possible. Aegon III spent much of his life trying to rebuild a realm devastated by civil war. The fields had to become productive once again. The cities needed to restore their trade. The roads had to be made safe. It was slow work. There were no quick remedies for the wounds left behind by a civil war. The generations that grew up during those years scarcely remembered the glory of the dragons. To many children, those magnificent creatures were beginning to seem as distant as the giants or the White Walkers. They still appeared in songs and stories, but no longer in the skies above. In time, the dynasty gradually recovered a measure of stability. One monarch succeeded another, governing a realm that slowly returned to normal. Some reigned only briefly. Others introduced important reforms. But none transformed the continent as Aegon the Conqueror or Jaehaerys the Conciliator had done before them. This was an age of consolidation, not expansion. Meanwhile, the great houses regained some of the influence they had lost during the early years of the conquest. The Starks continued to rule the vast north. The Lannisters went on accumulating immense wealth in the west. The Arryns preserved the security of the Vale. The Tyrells governed the fertile lands of the Reach. The Baratheons maintained their hold over Storm's End. Each acknowledged the authority of the Iron Throne. But all understood that the crown no longer possessed absolute power. Slowly, the balance of the realm began to resemble the one that had existed before the dragons. The difference was that now, a single king was recognized throughout the entire continent. That stability allowed new generations to flourish. Markets expanded. The ports welcomed ships from the free cities. The Maestas continued to broaden the knowledge preserved at the citadel. The knightly orders earned ever greater prestige. It was an imperfect peace. But it was enough for many throughout Westeros to believe that the darkest days were finally behind them. Yet beneath that outward calm, an old obsession endured. House Targaryen never abandoned the hope of restoring the dragons. Alchemists carried out experiments. Scholars studied ancient manuscripts brought from Valyria. Some princes dreamed of discovering forgotten dragon eggs that might restore their family's lost greatness. None of them succeeded. Every attempt ended with the same sobering reminder. Some powers, once lost, may never be recovered again. The impossibility of bringing the dragons back forced House Targaryen to accept a new reality. The prestige of the dynasty no longer rested upon legendary creatures, but upon the stability of the realm itself. Over the decades that followed, several monarchs occupied the Iron Throne with reigns of varying success, yet none decisively altered the course of history. Some strengthened the administration, others encouraged trade, and some remained little more than names recorded in the royal genealogies. There were periods of prosperity and moments of tension, but the monarchy endured thanks to a delicate balance between the crown and the great houses. Conflicts never truly disappeared, though they rarely reached the scale of the Dance of the Dragons. As the generations passed, the dragons ceased to be a living memory and became legends instead. The eggs preserved by the royal family remained cold and lifeless, like relics from a vanished world. Young princes grew up hearing stories of Balerion and Vaga in much the same way other children listened to tales of the Long Night or the Giants. Even so, the blood of old Valyria continued to inspire a deep fascination. Marriages within the royal family remained common, sustained by the belief that the tradition preserved a legacy that might one day reveal itself again. Meanwhile, the rest of Westeros continued its slow evolution. Cities expanded, trade routes grew stronger, and the great houses reinforced their own regional identities. The north remained profoundly different from the south. Dorne preserved its distinct character even after joining the realm through marriage alliances. And every region retained customs that served as reminders that the Seven Kingdoms had once been separate nations for thousands of years. That long period of relative peace convinced many that House Targaryen had finally overcome its darkest crises. But the history of royal dynasties rarely remains tranquil for very long. All it took was a disputed succession, an ambition left unchecked, or a prince determined to claim more than was rightfully his. And the balance that generations had painstakingly built could begin to crumble once again. The next great threat would not come from a foreign enemy. It would come from another branch of the blood of the dragon. The generations that grew up during those years scarcely remembered the glory of the dragons. To many children, those magnificent creatures were beginning to seem as distant as the giants or the White Walkers. They still appeared in songs and stories, but no longer in the skies above. In time, the dynasty gradually recovered a measure of stability. One monarch succeeded another, governing a realm that slowly returned to normal. Some reigned only briefly. Others introduced important reforms. But none transformed the continent as Aegon the Conqueror or Jaehaerys the Conciliator had done before them. This was an age of consolidation, not expansion. Meanwhile, the great houses regained some of the influence they had lost during the early years of the Conquest. The Starks continued to rule the vast north. The Lannisters went on accumulating immense wealth in the west. The Arryns preserved the security of the Vale. The Tyrells governed the fertile lands of the Reach. The Baratheons maintained their hold over Storm's End. Each acknowledged the authority of the Iron Throne. But all understood that the crown no longer possessed absolute power. Slowly, the balance of the realm began to resemble the one that had existed before the dragons. The difference was that now, a single king was recognized throughout the entire continent. That stability allowed new generations to flourish. Markets expanded. The ports welcomed ships from the free cities. The Maestas continued to broaden the knowledge preserved at the citadel. The knightly orders earned ever greater prestige. It was an imperfect peace. But it was enough for many throughout Westeros to believe that the darkest days were finally behind them. Yet beneath that outward calm, an old obsession endured. House Targaryen never abandoned the hope of restoring the dragons. Alchemists carried out experiments. Scholars studied ancient manuscripts brought from Valyria. Some princes dreamed of discovering forgotten dragon eggs that might restore their family's lost greatness. None of them succeeded. Every attempt ended with the same sobering reminder. Some powers, once lost, may never be recovered again. The next great crisis arrived during the reign of Aegon IV, a monarch whose legacy was defined by excess, indulgence, and reckless decisions. Remembered as Aegon the Unworthy, he rewarded nobles according to his shifting whims, weakened the authority of the crown, and sowed distrust even within his own family. Before his death, he made a decision whose consequences would echo for nearly a century. He legitimized several of his children born outside of marriage. Among them was Daemon Blackfyre, a warrior admired by much of the nobility and the bearer of the ancestral sword Blackfyre, the ancient symbol of Targaryen kingship. Many interpreted that act as an invitation to challenge the succession. When Daeron II inherited the Iron Throne, one part of the realm accepted his rule. Another believed that Daemon was the rightful king. Thus began the Blackfyre rebellions. 4 generations, different branches of the same family fought one another for the crown. They never reached the catastrophic scale of the Dance of the Dragons. But they kept Westeros in an almost constant state of uncertainty. One rebellion after another was crushed. Yet each conflict drained the realm of men, wealth, and confidence in the monarchy. At the same time, another historic change reshaped the political map of the Seven Kingdoms. After centuries of independence, Dorne finally became part of the realm, not through conquest, but through marriage alliances and careful diplomacy. It was a very different kind of victory from the one won by Aegon the Conqueror. It proved that some ambitions could be achieved through patience rather than fire. As the decades passed, the dynasty endured every one of these crises. Yet each new generation seemed a little farther removed from the glory of old Valyria. The dragons remained only a memory. The endless internal wars had diminished the prestige of the crown. And the great houses had once again accumulated power that rivaled that of the king himself. Even so, no one imagined that the greatest blow ever dealt to House Targaryen would not come from a rival branch of the family. It would come from a king incapable of ruling his own fears. A man whose name would become synonymous with madness. Aerys II Targaryen, the Mad King. Aerys II did not begin his reign as the man history would ultimately remember. In his early years, he appeared to be a promising king. He was intelligent, ambitious, and surrounded by capable advisors, foremost among them his childhood friend Tywin Lannister, whose administration brought the realm a stability that concealed many of the king's own shortcomings. But as time passed, Aerys began to trust no one. He saw conspiracies where none existed. He interpreted every success achieved by another man as a threat to his own authority. His friendship with Tywin slowly deteriorated into bitter rivalry, and the king's decisions became increasingly erratic. The turning point came with the defiance of Duskendale. During the uprising, Aerys was captured and remained a prisoner for several months. Although he was eventually rescued, he was never the same again. From that day forward, he lived consumed by fear, paranoia, and a growing obsession with fire. His court became a place of constant suspicion. Executions became ever more frequent. Old allies vanished. No one knew who might become the next target of the king's wrath. The crisis reached its breaking point when Brandon Stark traveled to King's Landing to demand an explanation for the alleged abduction of his sister, Lyanna. Aerys arrested him for treason. Soon afterward, he summoned Brandon's father, Rickard Stark, promising him a trial. What followed became one of the most horrifying episodes in the history of Westeros. Rickard was burned alive while Brandon struggled desperately to save him, only to die himself before the eyes of the royal court. Those deaths shattered the trust between the crown and several of the realm's greatest houses beyond repair. Far from stopping there, Aerys also demanded that Jon Arryn surrender his wards, Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon, so they could be executed. Jon Arryn made a decision that would change the course of history. He refused. With that single act, Robert's rebellion began. Within a matter of months, the Starks, Baratheons, Arryns, and later the Tullys joined forces against the Iron Throne. What had begun as a response to the tyranny of a single king soon became a war that sought to bring nearly 3 centuries of Targaryen rule to an end. After so many generations, the House of the Dragon once again faced the possibility of losing everything. Only this time, there were no dragons left to save it. The war was decided through a series of campaigns that reshaped the destiny of Westeros in remarkably little time. Robert Baratheon proved himself an exceptional commander. His sheer strength in battle inspired the men who fought beside him, while Eddard Stark and Jon Arryn held together the alliance that stood against the Iron Throne. The decisive battle was fought at the Trident. There, Robert faced Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, heir to the Iron Throne. Rhaegar was admired for both his intelligence and his skill as a warrior. Many believed he would have become a great king, had he ever lived to rule. But on that day, the fate of the dynasty was decided in only a few fleeting moments. Robert's warhammer crashed into the prince's chest, and Rhaegar fell mortally wounded into the waters of the river. With him perished the greatest hope House Targaryen still possessed. After that defeat, the kingdom's resistance quickly began to collapse. Tywin Lannister, who had remained on the sidelines through much of the conflict, finally marched upon King's Landing. Aerys believed his old hand had come to save him and ordered the gates of the city thrown open. It was a fatal mistake. Lannister soldiers sacked the capital while the desperate king ordered the city burned, intending to ignite the caches of wildfire hidden beneath its streets. He never carried out his plan. Before he could, a member of his own Kingsguard made a decision that would change history forever. Sir Jaime Lannister drove his sword through the king. With that single act, he saved King's Landing from destruction. But he also broke the most sacred oath a knight could swear. From that day onward, he would be known as the Kingslayer. A title spoken for years with contempt by those who never knew the reason for his choice. Soon afterward, Robert Baratheon entered the capital and was proclaimed king. After nearly 300 years, House Targaryen had lost the Iron Throne. Only a handful of its members managed to escape. On the island of Dragonstone, Queen Rhaella gave birth to one last son as a great storm raged across the sea. The boy was named Viserys. Not long afterward, Daenerys Targaryen was born as well, and she too was carried into exile across the narrow sea. With them, it seemed that the blood of the dragon had finally reached its end. A new era began under the rule of House Baratheon. But as had happened so many times throughout the history of Westeros, the end of a dynasty did not mean the end of its legacy. Across the narrow sea, the last Targaryens grew up far from the home they had never truly known, convinced that one day they would return to reclaim what they believed was theirs by right. Robert Baratheon's reign began with a resounding military victory. But ruling a kingdom proved very different from conquering one. 4 years, the new king devoted himself to tournaments, hunting, and lavish feasts, leaving much of the burden of government to his former mentor, Jon Arryn, and later to his old friend, Eddard Stark. Meanwhile, the great houses steadily regained the influence they had once possessed before the unquestioned supremacy of the Targaryens. The Lannisters amassed ever greater wealth and influence at court. The Starks remained steadfast to their ancient traditions in the north. The Baratheons occupied the Iron Throne, though they became increasingly dependent upon fragile political alliances. Across the narrow sea, Viserys and Daenerys grew up in exile. They drifted from one free city to another, surviving on the hospitality of those who still remembered the fallen dynasty. Viserys never stopped insisting that one day they would return to reclaim the crown. Daenerys, however, remembered almost nothing of Westeros. To her, the Lost Kingdom was little more than a story her brother told again and again. As the years passed, Robert gradually abandoned his pursuit of the few remaining enemies who might still threaten his throne. He believed the Targaryens had been destroyed forever. Without realizing it, the greatest danger was not growing in exile. It was taking shape within his own kingdom. The death of Jon Arryn set in motion a chain of events that would once again transform Westeros. Eddard Stark traveled to King's Landing to serve as the new hand of the king. What he uncovered there was a tangled web of secrets, rivalries, and betrayals that reached into the very heart of the royal family. Not long afterward, the unexpected death of Robert Baratheon left the Iron Throne without a ruler capable of holding the Seven Kingdoms together. Within a matter of weeks, the continent fractured once more. Robb Stark was proclaimed king in the north. Stannis and Renly Baratheon each laid claim to the Iron Throne. Joffrey ruled from King's Landing with the backing of House Lannister. Alliances collapsed. Old oaths lost their meaning. The War of the Five Kings had begun, the great conflict already underway when the story of Game of Thrones opens. And while the great lords of Westeros once again fought for power, far across the narrow sea, a young exile was about to achieve what generations had believed impossible: the return of the dragons. At that moment, stories that had followed separate paths for centuries finally began to converge. In the north, Jon Snow discovered that the wall guarded far more than a border. In Essos, Daenerys gathered followers as her dragons grew stronger with every passing season. In King's Landing, the Lannisters struggled to hold on to a power that seemed to be slipping through their fingers. And beyond the frozen forests, the Night King marched south with an army that swelled after every battle. For the first time since the Long Night, the fate of Westeros no longer depended solely upon men. It also depended upon memory. The ancient tales that so many had dismissed as little more than legends proved to contain very real warnings. The wall had not been built out of pride. The Night's Watch had not endured for 8,000 years merely out of tradition. And the dragons were never simply symbols of Targaryen power. They had once formed part of the fragile balance that held the world together. When Daenerys finally crossed the narrow sea, the blood of the dragon returned to Westeros. When Jon united ancient enemies against the army of the dead, the spirit of the old alliance between the first men and the children of the forest was reborn. And when the great lords realized they had to stand together, history seemed to repeat itself after thousands of years. The war against the White Walkers revealed a truth that had echoed throughout this entire story. Empires rise. Dynasties fade. Kings come and go. But the greatest threats almost always outlast those who rule. Even after the Night King was defeated, Westeros still had one final war to fight for the Iron Throne. The struggle between Daenerys Targaryen and Cersei Lannister brought centuries of rivalry between the great houses to their conclusion and ended with the destruction of King's Landing, the city Aegon the Conqueror had founded nearly 300 years earlier. With Daenerys' death, the last true attempt to restore Targaryen rule came to an end. Soon afterward, Bran Stark was chosen as king by the great lords of Westeros. It was a decision that symbolized the end of an era. For the first time since the Conquest, the realm would no longer belong to a single ruling dynasty. In fact, the Iron Throne itself no longer existed. It had been melted by Drogon's fire, as though the last dragon had chosen to erase forever the symbol that had inspired so many wars. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson in the entire history of Westeros. For thousands of years, countless men and women fought to claim a seat forged from swords. Yet the greatest dangers never truly came from that throne. They arose from pride, from ambition, and from humanity's refusal to learn from those who had come before. And so, as the seasons continue to turn and the ancient castles stand silently watching the passage of time, the stories of the first men, of old Valyria, of Aegon the Conqueror, and of the last dragons remain woven together into a single tale. Not merely the story of one family, nor even of one kingdom, but the complete history of a world that, much like our own, never ceased to change. And so, after thousands of years of wars, empires, kings, and legends, we arrive at the moment when the story most people know as Game of Thrones finally begins. But perhaps, after making this long journey together, it becomes easier to understand that none of those conflicts emerged out of nowhere. Every decision, every alliance, and every betrayal had roots stretching back through the centuries, reaching into a history far older than it first appeared when the opening episode began. The castles we see throughout the series had already watched countless generations come and go. The great houses carried with them memories, pride, and wounds accumulated over thousands of years. Even the dragons, the White Walkers, and the Iron Throne itself were only the latest chapters in a story that had begun long before any of the characters we remember were ever born. Perhaps that is one of the reasons this world feels so believable. It does not feel like a fantasy built around a handful of heroes. It feels like a complete civilization, shaped slowly by the passage of time, much like the great cultures of our own history. And as winter settles over Westeros once again, the ancient strongholds remain silent, the forests continue to guard their secrets, and the wind still sweeps along the wall, as though the stories of those who lived thousands of years ago had never truly faded away. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the complete history of the world of Game of Thrones. I hope this voyage has allowed you to discover details that once went unnoticed and, above all, that it has brought you a peaceful night. Rest well. And until our next story.